Hey guys, tonight we sink our teeth into the greasy, crunchy, and occasionally alarming world of ancient Roman junk food. You might imagine Roman food as all grapes, goblets, and golden platters, but honestly, you're more likely to be chewing on stale flatbread and mystery-fried rodents than lounging in a marble banquet hall. So let's do this right. Picture it, cobblestone slick with olive oil, steam rising from terracotta pots, and the unmistakable scent of slightly burnt honey fritters mixing with the sweat of 1,000 tunic-wearing passers-by. You're standing in the middle of a Roman marketplace, stomach growling, surrounded by the ancient equivalent of food trucks. Except, well, these trucks are wooden carts, and they definitely don't pass any modern health inspection. You probably won't survive this on your gut alone, but it's worth the adventure. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander through the Roman Forum around midday. The sun glares down from its imperial perch, and the air is thick with chatter, trade, and the ever-present smell of cooking oil. There's no McDonald's here, no tacos or bubble tea, just bubbling pots of lentils, skewers of spiced meat, and the chirping call of a vendor hawking fried dormice. Yes. Dormice. Plump, furred, and rolled in poppy seeds. Don't worry, they're probably dead before they hit the pan. Probably. This is Rome's street food scene, humble, hectic, and endlessly inventive. For a couple of bronze coins, you could snag a hot meal from a popina, a street-side food stall that catered to the lower and middle classes, people without private kitchens. These places were the lifeblood of working Romans who didn't have time, or servants, to cook 3 meals a day. Mainstream historical records show that most Romans lived in cramped insulae, multi-story apartment blocks where home cooking was impractical, if not outright dangerous. Fires were a real concern, especially with all those open flames and wooden beams. So instead, you head downstairs, down the creaky stone steps, and grab something hot off the grill at your local popina. What's on the menu? You've got pulse, a kind of barley porridge, sausages sizzling over charcoal, roasted chickpeas, and libum, a cheesy little flatbread you might dip in honey if you're feeling luxurious. And let's not forget the mulled wine served steaming hot from enormous clay urns, flavored with herbs, or occasionally, ash. Yes, some recipes included a bit of burned bone or shell for minerals. Your modern gut is already whimpering. Fringe sources even mention deep-fried lettuce. That's right, battered and fried. You have to admire the Roman commitment to finding new ways to make plants feel like they don't belong in a salad. And if you're in the mood for something sweet, vendors whip up fritters called scriblety, puffs of dough fried in lard and doused in honey. Think of it like an ancient donut, but grittier. Literally. Because ancient Roman flour wasn't exactly refined, it often contained bits of stone from the milling process. Tasty, yes. Tooth-friendly? Not at all. Now, one oddity you stumble upon as you make your way through the crowd is a stall with what looks like a cage. Inside it, a selection of live dormice, chubby and drowsy. The vendor reaches in, picks one up, and, after a quick moment out of view, starts prepping it with pepper, herbs, and honey. According to sources like Apicius, these delicacies were often stuffed with minced meat and nuts before being roasted or fried. Think of it like Roman jalapeno poppers, if jalapenos were rodents. Historians still argue whether dormice were an everyday snack for the common folk or a status dish saved for the wealthy. But let's be honest, if you're buying yours from a guy named Flavius on a street corner, it's probably not top shelf. There's also the matter of public ovens. Some streets featured communal baking spaces where locals could bring their dough and have it baked for a fee. It sounds charming, like a neighborhood pizza oven, until you remember the lack of hygiene standards and the very real possibility that your bread comes out sharing space with someone else's dead mouse pie. You make your way past an old woman shouting about lentil stew. It's bubbling in a blackened cauldron, its surface shimmering with a suspicious amount of oil. Still, the smell is comforting: herbs, vinegar, garlic. It's the kind of food that tastes better than it looks, especially when served in a crude clay bowl with a wooden spoon carved by someone who probably didn't enjoy the task. Every few steps, someone offers you something: olives soaking in brine, dried figs stuffed with sesame paste, salted fish heads that crunch like ancient popcorn. It's a buffet of chaos, and your modern palate isn't sure whether to be intrigued or horrified. Of course, not everyone's eating like this. The elite Romans wouldn't be caught dead at a popina unless they were slumming it for political clout, or running low on kitchen slaves. They dined behind closed doors, waited on hand and foot. But even the elites had their cravings, and sometimes, even they slipped out for a greasy bite or two. And here's the weird part: among all this casual snacking, Rome had no real restaurants, in the modern sense. No places with menus, reservations, and candlelight. Just a city alive with mouthfuls, where food came fast, cheap, and often wrapped in a fig leaf. You grab one last honey-drenched fritter before ducking away from a drunken man trying to sell you a jar of fermented turnip juice. No, thank you. As you head down the alley, full but uncertain about your life choices, the aroma of stew and frying oil still clings to your tunic. Your stomach's rumbling in protest, or maybe anticipation. You shuffle a little deeper into the city, your tunic sticking slightly in the Roman humidity, when the scent of lentils and overboiled cabbage leads you straight to one of the most common sights in urban Rome, the thermopolium. These were the ancient world's answer to the fast food joint: no golden arches, but lots of bubbling pots and shouting vendors. A thermopolium is a rectangular shop front, often open to the street, with a long, stone counter embedded with round clay jars called dolia. Inside those jars, hot food. Well, hot-ish, depending on how long the jar's been sitting out. Think of it like walking into a sandwich shop where your meal is kept inside a big terracotta planter: aromatic, yes. Sanitary. Let's just say the Romans hadn't discovered refrigeration, and they weren't shy about reusing yesterday's stew. You hover near the counter, pretending not to notice the fly doing laps around a fish head. A cook with sweat on his brow and soot on his hands ladles something brown and lumpy into a shallow bowl. It could be lentils, or maybe chickpeas, or maybe a bit of both plus a mystery ingredient he won't name. You accept it with a nod and grab a hunk of bread, so hard it might double as a weapon. Mainstream historians tell us there were thousands of thermopolia in the larger cities, especially in places like Pompeii, where archaeologists have found dozens of these counters preserved under volcanic ash. There's even one with a fresco of a rooster painted proudly above it, advertising its specialty: spiced poultry, presumably not cooked in the ash. And yes, some of these stalls had bar seating. Think of them as the Roman version of high-top tables without the chairs. The standard fare is predictable but hearty: boiled beans, stewed onions, spiced sausage, maybe a chunk of fish if it's your lucky day, or unlucky, depending on how long it's been aging. You might get a slice of cold meat left over from a banquet, or a mix of mashed vegetables swimming in olive oil. A few vendors offer wine too, served warm, diluted, and often flavored with herbs, honey, or resin. Roman wine rarely came pure; drinking it straight was considered barbaric. In fact, the stronger your wine, the more suspect you looked. So, you take a sip of mulsum, that's wine mixed with honey, and immediately question your choices. It's sweet, yes, but also has a faint note of anchovy. A surprise crossover, courtesy of a reused amphora. One fringe anecdote tells of thermopolia that catered specifically to hangover cures, serving up vinegary broths, salted fish paste, and a chewy cake made from millet. Historians still argue whether these were common establishments or just an exaggeration from satirical poets who loved mocking Rome's bleary-eyed morning-after crowd. You spot a group of men playing dice nearby. One slams a hand on the counter and demands something stronger than wine. The vendor shrugs, scoops something from a second dolia, and hands over what looks suspiciously like a shot glass made from baked clay. The man drinks it, winces, and laughs. You ask what it was. The vendor grins. Goat milk and wormwood. You move on. Over by another counter, a woman serves up spiced lentils and barley cakes to a line of workers covered in brick dust. This is the real Roman dining experience, sweaty, social, and deeply satisfying if you set your expectations low enough. Everyone's elbow to elbow, shouting over each other, dipping crusts of bread into shared bowls. There's no menu, no receipt, just hunger and habit. Some thermopolia were more than just snack stops, they doubled as local hangouts, especially in lower-class neighborhoods. Rumors and gossip flowed as freely as the diluted wine. You'd hear about a neighbor's stolen goat, a merchant's cheating wife, or some senator's new scandal involving a garden slave and a misdelivered crate of figs. For a little extra, some stalls even offered extras beyond food. Let's just say the line between thermopolium and brothel was sometimes thin, and greasy. Roman graffiti backs this up, with inscriptions like, "We serve hot food and hot women," carved right into the wall. Classy. Still, most Romans didn't have time for leisure while scarfing lentils. These were working people, builders, bakers, sailors, street performers, all grabbing fuel before heading back into the chaos of the city. In fact, some of them probably couldn't even read the menu if there was one. Literacy rates weren't high among the lower classes, so instead of signs, vendors relied on painted images or simply shouted the daily specials. One curious scholarly debate circles around how much these shops contributed to the spread of disease. Some argue that foodborne illness must have been rampant, given the limited sanitation and total lack of health codes. Others believe the high use of vinegar, herbs, and salt actually helped preserve food and reduce pathogens. There's no definitive answer, but you'll probably think twice before drinking unfiltered wine from a communal ladle. As the sun starts to set, the mood shifts. Lamps are lit, simple clay bowls with flickering oil flames, and the scent in the air turns darker, more charcoal, more charred meat. Nighttime brings a different crowd. Less workers, more gamblers and shady merchants looking for a cheap meal and a place to nurse their bad choices. You finish your bowl, place your cracked clay spoon back on the counter, and slip away into the shadows with the rest of the city, your belly full of barley, beans, and questions about what exactly was in that stew. Your feet crunch over gravel and grain husks as you move away from the bustling thermopolia and toward the gladiator barracks, because while most Romans were grabbing oily fritters and sips of mulsum, a very different class of diner was fueling up just across town. You duck under a wooden arch, pass a couple of surly-looking men with scars on their forearms, and find yourself inside a training yard, packed with sweat, grunts, and the unmistakable thud of fists meeting sand. Here, in the ludus, Rome's gladiators are hard at work, and very, very hungry. Now, you might assume these fighters gorged on rare meats and high-protein feasts. After all, they were celebrities of the arena, brutal demigods whose names echoed in cheering stadiums. Surely their diets were carved from the same heroic cloth. Not quite. Mainstream evidence, including bone analysis from sites like Ephesus, tells a very different story. Gladiators were nicknamed horderii, barley men, because that's what they ate. Lots of barley. And beans. And lentils. Throw in some millet, a drizzle of oil, and maybe some dried fruit, and that's your daily menu. Carbs, carbs, and a splash of fiber. The idea was bulk, not burn. Gladiators were meant to be big, think padded slabs of muscle and fat. That extra layer. It actually protected vital organs from shallow wounds. So much for washboard abs. Today, your lunch would be a thick porridge called pulse, made of barley mashed with water and salt, sometimes enhanced with garum if you were lucky, or unlucky, depending on how fresh it was. The porridge is served lukewarm in a dented metal bowl. It sticks to your spoon, your tongue, your very soul. Still, it gets the job done. And while there's debate over how much meat was really consumed, most historians agree it wasn't common. Meat was expensive, even in a city obsessed with conquest. It was usually reserved for festivals, rewards, or unlucky animals from the arena. Some trainers, ever cost-efficient, supplemented protein with goat milk or the occasional egg, but certainly not T-bone steaks or roasted boar. That was for the guys watching, not the ones bleeding. Now, here's the real kicker: after meals, gladiators were often given an ancient Roman health drink made from vinegar and ash. No, not metaphorical ash, real, honest-to-Jupiter wood ash, usually from burned bones or charred plants. Mixed with water and sometimes vinegar, this chalky elixir was thought to replenish calcium and strengthen bones. Imagine slamming a protein shake that tastes like a campfire and you're halfway there. One fringe theory even suggests that ash was used strategically to dull the pain of injury, less as a nutrient, more as a kind of pre-modern placebo/punishment. Did it work? Historians still argue whether it had measurable benefits or was just a grim tradition passed down by habit. You sit near a couple of fighters, spooning down your barley slop as one of them jokes about a rookie throwing up mid-match last week. They laugh and shove each other, as comfortable with violence as they are with indigestion. There's also a social layer here worth chewing on. Gladiators, despite their fame, were often slaves or prisoners, trained under brutal discipline. Their diets weren't about enjoyment, they were calculated, regulated, and repetitive. You didn't eat to savor. You ate to survive, to heal, to fight again tomorrow. And always with just enough energy to keep swinging, but not enough autonomy to leave. Still, the barrack sometimes tried to boost morale with treats, dried figs, a dollop of honey on feast days, or better cuts of meat after a big win. Victors might even be treated to a full banquet hosted by a wealthy patron, though it probably felt a bit odd celebrating survival with the same people who placed bets on your death. You watch a grizzled veteran scrape the last of his meal from the pot and crush a clove of garlic between his fingers, popping it straight into his mouth like a candy. Keeps the demons out, he mutters. Or maybe the crowd. There's an underlying tension here: food as fuel, food as control. Gladiators didn't get to choose what they ate. They had no personal chefs, no luxury of boredom. It was all prescribed, measured out like medicine, but without the consent. You eat what you're given, or you don't eat. Simple. What's more, some accounts suggest gladiators were even overfed before matches, to make their bodies heavier and more dramatic when they fell. A bit of dark theater, seasoned with human tragedy. The sun begins to dip, casting long shadows over the training yard. The fighters finish their meals and return to their drills, their bare feet kicking up sand as wooden swords clash and barked commands echo through the fading light. As you rise and dust barley flakes off your tunic, you can't help but feel the weight of it all, not just in your stomach, but in the system. Food, here, isn't just nutrition. It's a tool. A chain. A bargain you didn't choose but still have to stomach. And somehow, with all their grit and lentils, these men still captivated the empire. Fed on mush, cheered like gods, and always just one meal away from their next blood-stained performance. You've just left the world of sweaty barracks and barley porridge, still feeling the faint aftertaste of ash on your tongue, when you take a sharp turn and find yourself in the heart of decadence, the palace kitchens of Rome's emperors. Gone are the chipped clay bowls and vinegary stews. Here, dinner means a team of enslaved chefs preparing culinary madness, all for one man reclining on a velvet cushion while a lyre plays softly in the background. If you think modern influencers are excessive with their gold leaf lattes and 12-course brunches, just wait until you see what Emperor Elagabalus had for lunch. Spoiler, it might include camel heels, parrot tongues, and a casual scattering of pearls dissolved in vinegar. You don't belong here, not really, but tonight, let's pretend you're a dinner guest. You're escorted into the triclinium, a Roman dining room, with marble floors, walls frescoed with Bacchic imagery, and low couches arranged in a U-shape around a table groaning with silver platters. The air smells like roasted meat, honeyed pastries, and something unmistakably aquatic. A flute player pipes softly from the corner while servants tiptoe through the shadows carrying trays. The emperor enters. He nods, sprawls on a cushion, and gives a casual wave. Showtime. A parade of dishes begins. The first is peacock, not the meat, just the brains. Lightly poached, seasoned with myrrh, and served in a silver spoon. Next, you're offered flamingo tongue. Supposedly the tenderest part of the bird, and far too expensive to enjoy without feeling slightly ridiculous. Mainstream Roman texts, like those of Suetonius and Pliny, detail these elaborate imperial meals with something between awe and revulsion. It wasn't about nutrition. It was about status, novelty, and spectacle. If it was rare, foreign, or ethically questionable, it made the menu. A dish arrives in the shape of a boar, roasted whole, mouth stuffed with live thrushes. The moment it's cut open, the birds flutter into the air, one grazes your forehead in a panic. Everyone applauds. You're a little traumatized. Then there's the fish. So many fish. Not because the emperor likes seafood, but because he likes to watch the colors shift as exotic fish from distant provinces slowly expire in crystal bowls. One story claims Emperor Claudius ordered eels kept in a tank of milk. Whether for flavor or cruelty remains debatable. Historians still argue whether these displays were exaggerated by Roman writers who enjoyed mocking the elite, or whether the emperors were truly that unhinged. Next comes the dormice again. Yes, we're back, but these are not the crunchy street vendor variety. These are premium dormice, raised on a diet of nuts and honey, stuffed with minced pork, pine nuts, and pepper, and glazed with date syrup. They're served on miniature gold plates shaped like acorns. You're no longer hungry. You're concerned. One fringe source mentions Emperor Vitellius's most infamous feast, reportedly consisting of 2,000 fish and 7,000 birds. Included were flamingo tongues, pheasant brains, lamprey liver, and eggs of exotic birds arranged in the shape of Rome's provinces. It's unclear how much of this is real and how much is poetic exaggeration, but either way, the indigestion must have been epic. And let's not forget the sauces. Every dish arrives bathed in something. Garum, of course, that fermented fish sauce we'll revisit later, but also sauces made from mulberries, vinegar, honey, mustard, and wine. The flavors crash together like a wild party in your mouth where no one respects personal boundaries. At some point, a servant offers you a wine goblet. The wine is spiced, warm, and so sweet it borders on syrup. Floating in it, gold flakes. You sip politely and feel poorer by association. As you recline, stuffed and mildly overwhelmed, you glance at your fellow diners. A senator dips bread into a quail egg custard while muttering about taxes. A poet debates the merits of flamingo meat versus stork. Someone across the table just sneezed, and instead of a napkin, a slave dabs their nose with perfumed linen. And then comes the final insult, dessert. You're thinking something simple. Maybe a figure. But no, this is Rome. You're presented with dates stuffed with pine nuts and pepper, fried in honey, then rolled in gold dust. There's also a layered cake of cheese and spelt, soaked in wine, sliced thin like papyrus scrolls. And fruit. Imported from across the empire, Egyptian pomegranates, African melons, and Persian cherries. The cherries still have the stalks on. Pure showmanship. You lean back, uncomfortably full, unsure if this is a meal or a vaguely edible hallucination. But the emperor is smiling, content. He's proven his wealth and power not by what he eats, but by how absurdly he can eat it. Oddly, not all emperors indulged this way. Marcus Aurelius, for example, was known for his stoic restraint, preferring simple foods like coarse bread and plain olives. But he was the exception, not the rule. For most emperors, extravagance wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. It was propaganda you could chew. And sometimes, it chewed back. Emperor Claudius reportedly died from poisoned mushrooms, possibly slipped into his lavish dinner by a power-hungry wife. When your meals come with gold flakes and live birds, it's probably easy to miss a dash of arsenic. The dinner ends not with a dessert, but with vomiting. Not yours, though you're tempted, but from several guests who quietly excuse themselves to make room for another round. The Romans didn't see purging as disgusting. It was practical. It meant more space for pleasure. Vomiting mid-banquet was seen as strategic dining. You suppress a shiver. You rise, legs wobbly, stomach a battlefield, head full of strange sauces and stranger customs. The banquet may be over, but the emperor's appetite never is. You wake the next morning with a stomach that still feels like it's negotiating terms of surrender. That imperial feast was something. And now, walking through the dusty side streets of a less glamorous district, you're in search of something more humble, more digestible. Bread. Surely that's safe, right? Wrong. Bread is everywhere in Rome. On tables, in markets, even in tombs. Seriously, archaeologists have found loaves left as grave offerings, fossilized into brick-like chunks. It's the backbone of Roman cuisine, the food of soldiers, senators, slaves, and snackers alike. But don't be fooled by its ubiquity. This bread is not the fluffy, golden loaf of your modern dreams. You bite into a small round loaf called panis quadratus. It's hard. Really hard. Like, I might break a tooth, hard. And that's not just your soft modern enamel talking. Ancient Roman bread was notoriously gritty. Not because they were going for rustic texture, but because their stone mills ground grain with small flecks of the actual millstones themselves. Yes, your morning toast comes with bonus minerals, mostly quartz. Mainstream historical accounts tell us that this wasn't a minor issue. Over time, all that grit wore down Roman teeth so badly that even young adults had significant dental abrasion. Dental hygiene was not exactly high-tech either. Toothpaste was a mix of crushed bones and oyster shells. Mint flavor? Not so much. And yet, bread was a daily staple. Bakers rose before dawn, kneading coarse flour mixed with water, salt, and maybe a touch of sourdough starter if they were fancy. The dough was baked in communal ovens, some public, some attached to wealthier homes. Rome had whole streets of bakeries, often hot and crowded, where the scent of warm bread mingled with smoke and ash. You pass a bakery now, small, smoky, with a fresco on the wall showing a man kneading dough while another shoves it into a domed oven with a long paddle. The image looks idyllic, but the air inside stings your eyes. A boy pulls a tray of loaves from the coals, and you swear half of them are already burned on the bottom. One fringe discovery from Pompeii revealed carbonized loaves still bearing the bakery's stamp. Yes, they stamped bread. Like branding your sourdough with a family crest, both for status and to prove you paid your grain tax. And if you didn't? Well, the grain dole was the Roman welfare system, free wheat for the citizens of Rome. But if someone tampered with the flour weights, diluted the dough, or faked their status, they'd face serious consequences. Fines, public shaming, or worse, cut off from your carbs. You pick up a loaf from a street vendor. It's wrapped in a fig leaf and costs a few copper coins. The crust is charred, the inside is dense and a bit sour. It's filling, though. You chew slowly, careful of your molars. You think you feel a grain of sand. Or is that obsidian? Historians still argue whether all Roman bread was this awful, or if the worst examples were reserved for the poor. Wealthier Romans had access to finer flour, silico, which was sifted more thoroughly and whiter in color. But for the average person, bread was survival, not indulgence. And speaking of indulgence, bread wasn't always eaten plain. The Romans loved dipping it in everything: olive oil, vinegar, garum, or wine. One popular breakfast was bread soaked in watered-down wine, like a soggy proto-French toast, minus the eggs and maple syrup. Kids loved it. Adults tolerated it. Your modern taste buds may not survive it. You pass a group of laborers eating their mid-morning meal, bread dipped in wine, olives, maybe a scrap of cheese if they've got a decent employer. They laugh and elbow each other, tearing off crusts with their teeth. One man pulls a small knife from his belt to saw his way through a particularly rebellious loaf. He nods to you. "Good batch today," he says through a mouthful. You nod politely and pretend not to be bleeding. Curiously, some Roman physicians recommended bread as medicine. Burned bread was ground into powder and used for everything from digestive issues to wounds. Yes, you might sprinkle a bit on a gash to stop the bleeding. Historians aren't sure whether this was based on observed success or pure desperation. Either way, you're not trying it. In fact, the symbolic power of bread went far beyond the bakery. Politicians used it, literally, as bait. Bread and circuses wasn't just a turn of phrase. Distribute free grain and fund a few gladiator games, and suddenly, no one's asking awkward questions about corruption or border wars. Food was control, especially when it came in the form of daily loaves. You find a bakery that also sells flavored breads, rare, but not unheard of. There's cheese bread, poppy seed bread, and even loaves mixed with honey and figs. You buy a small slice of the fig variety and take a cautious bite. It's still dense. Still gritty. But surprisingly sweet. You could almost call it cake, if you were desperate, and blindfolded, and a little lonely. As the sun climbs higher, you realize that bread wasn't just a Roman food, it was the Roman food. More than meat, more than wine, more than any imperial delicacy. It was the edible currency of the empire, fueling everything from stonemasons to senators. You dust off the crumbs, check your teeth for damage, and step back into the street, grateful for carbs, even the dangerous kind. The loaf sits heavy in your gut, like a warm stone. Comforting. And possibly permanent. You leave behind the soot-smudged bakeries and the ever-present crunch of quartz-laced bread, stepping now into the shadier alleys where amphorae clink and the scent of fermented grapes lingers in the air. It's time to drink, carefully. Because in ancient Rome, drinks weren't just about thirst. They were about chemistry, class, and some very questionable recipes. Welcome to the world of Molsum, seawater wine, and a beverage cabinet that might just make your stomach reconsider everything. You arrive at a papina, a dive bar, essentially. There's a man snoring against a pillar, a dice game in full swing, and on the counter, several enormous clay jugs, each sealed with wax and labeled with symbols you don't understand. The bartender eyes you and gestures to the lineup. Red, sweet, or interesting. You pick the middle. He grins. You've chosen Molsum, the Roman favorite, young wine mixed with honey. Sometimes served warm, sometimes cold, and always varying wildly in quality. Your first sip is surprisingly pleasant, fruity, sweet, a little musky. Then a strange aftertaste kicks in. Is that herbs? Or maybe pine resin? Here's the thing, Roman wine wasn't filtered the way we know it. Amphorae were sealed with pitch or resin, which often flavored the drink. Some vintners even added seawater to preserve their product during transport. The result? Salty undertones that no sommelier would dare describe as complex. Mainstream sources tell us Roman wine was almost always diluted, usually 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric. Literally. That's what they thought uncivilized people did. So if you order a strong pour, expect judgmental stares, or maybe an impromptu philosophy lecture from a nearby senator. Now, this bar also serves pasca, a sour mix of water, vinegar, and sometimes herbs. It was the drink of the army, of laborers, of anyone who couldn't afford proper wine. Cheap, mildly antiseptic, and more palatable than river water. You sip it and your lips pucker instantly. It tastes like salad dressing gone rogue. Still, it's safer than the Tiber. Then there's calda, hot water mixed with spiced wine, often consumed in winter. The Roman version of mulled wine, if mulled wine sometimes included ash. Yes, ash again. Some recipes called for crushed charcoal or charred bones, allegedly for medicinal reasons. Historians still argue whether this was health science or just another chapter in Rome's long tradition of eating alarming things on purpose. You're offered a strange glass, more like a tiny bowl, of something brownish and aromatic. It's wine, yes, but mixed with myrrh. It smells like a funeral, but the locals swear by it. Good for the digestion, one man tells you. Or the soul, says another. You take a sip. It burns. You smile politely. For the wealthy, wine was a status symbol. The best vintages came from Falernian hills and were aged for decades. Poets like Horace waxed lyrical about such wines, while Pliny the Elder warned against cheap imitations. Counterfeiting was rampant. Amphorae were often refilled and resold with false labels. You might think you're drinking Falernian, but you're actually sipping second-hand grog from a reused fish sauce jug. Bon appetit! In fringe Roman taverns, especially in the seedier parts of town, bartenders sometimes improved their wine with additives. Lead acetate was one of them, sweet, toxic, and undetectable to ancient taste buds. Some scholars believe chronic lead poisoning may have contributed to Rome's decline, subtly eroding the ruling class's health one indulgent sip at a time. You pause, mid-swallow, reconsidering that honeyed note you thought was charming. Maybe just one cup tonight. Around you, the patrons argue, flirt, gamble, and occasionally nap. Wine in Rome wasn't a private affair, it was public, messy, and essential. People drank at meals, in temples, at funerals, and even during business meetings. Sobriety was not a virtue. Moderation. Optional. There were also drinking customs, many of them baffling. One man raises his glass and shouts, "Bibe," which you soon learn is, drink, and part of a popular call and response at Roman gatherings. Another slaps the back of his neck, a sign that he's had enough, or has a mosquito problem. Hard to tell. The walls are decorated with graffiti. Some of it surprisingly poetic, "May your drink be as sweet as your mistress." Others are less romantic, "I made love and drank wine here." Both were cheap. You admire the honesty. A server brings over a tray of finger foods, olives, salted nuts, maybe a bit of fish jerky. Drinking in Rome was rarely done without food. It's a social lubricant, sure, but also a digestive aid. And perhaps, more importantly, it helps you forget that your drink might contain seawater, ash, or the lingering whisper of amphor mold. You step out into the cooling night, your head fuzzy and your palate thoroughly confused. You've tasted sweetness, salt, and smoke, and somehow, you're still standing. The Romans had no shortage of creativity when it came to making wine stretch, last, and sometimes sparkle. You wonder if they ever sat around wondering, is this safe? Probably not. That's what the slaves were for. You shake your head, breath tinged with vinegar and myrrh, and head toward your next stop, one that smells even stranger than the bar you've just left. Your nose wrinkles before your feet even reach the next alley. The scent hits hard, fishy, sour, tangy, and strangely sweet. It's the kind of smell that suggests something has gone horribly wrong but is still somehow being sold as a delicacy. You've arrived at the source of one of Rome's most prized, and polarizing, culinary staples, garum. Garum is the Roman answer to ketchup, soy sauce, Worcestershire, and a gut punch all rolled into one. It's a fermented fish sauce, made by layering the innards of small fish, anchovies, mackerel, sardines, with heaps of salt and letting it all bake in the sun for weeks, sometimes months. Yes, bake. Outdoors. In amphorae. With zero lids. And even less shame. The result? A thick, amber-colored liquid prized for its umami-rich kick and loved by everyone from legionaries to emperors. You step cautiously toward a garum shop, where enormous clay jars bubble ominously under the sun, their contents stirring slightly, possibly on their own. A vendor grins at you with teeth as yellow as the sauce he stirs. He hands you a small bowl. "Try it," he says. You do. And instantly regret it. It's salty. So salty it bypasses your tongue and slaps the back of your skull. Then the fish flavor kicks in. Deep. Earthy. Like an anchovy decided to haunt your taste buds. And then, sweetness. Maybe some herbs. And then it's gone, but it's not. It lingers. Like a memory you wish you didn't have. Mainstream Roman texts describe garum as essential. Apicius, the famous Roman cookbook author, includes it in almost everything: meats, vegetables, desserts. Yes, even desserts. It wasn't just seasoning. It was the seasoning. If you didn't have garum, were you even cooking? Historians note that garum factories were major industries, especially in coastal cities like Pompeii and Carthago Nova. But they weren't popular with the neighbors. The smell? Unforgettable. Offensive. Apocalyptic. In fact, real estate near a garum plant was notably cheaper. No one wanted to live downwind of rotting mackerel juice. You spot a team of workers hauling full amphorae onto carts. These are bound for inland markets where garum was sold in different grades, ranging from the fancy liquamen, clear and expensive, to the murky sludge that was probably just fish water with dreams. The best garum could cost more than fine wine, and wealthy households might even have their own secret recipe. Fringe sources mention formulas that included herbs, honey, or even bits of fruit to round out the flavor. A kind of ancient artisanal fish sauce, if you will. One source even jokes that bad garum was used to strip paint. You laugh, until you watch a man rinse his sandals in the cheaper variety to kill the odor of the latrines. Apparently, it works. You pass by a garum merchant who's shouting prices and extolling the health benefits of his particular blend. Good for digestion. For strength. For love, he bellows. He might not be lying. Some Roman physicians prescribed diluted garum as medicine for everything from dog bites to stomach cramps. Historians still argue whether this had any basis in fact, or was just the world's fishiest placebo. A local cook gives you a tour of his larder. Every shelf has at least one jug of garum, some opened, some sealed with wax and stamped with a merchant's mark. He dips a ladle into a bubbling stew and adds a generous splash. You watch the pot shudder slightly. Better than salt, he says. Makes everything taste like more. You ask what's in the stew. He shrugs. Turnips. Leeks. Maybe some goat. You ask if it tastes better with garum. He shrugs again. What doesn't? Roman cuisine was built on this sauce. It unified the palate of an empire that spanned continents. Whether you were eating dormice in Rome, lentils in Gaul, or barley cakes in Judea, there was a good chance they'd all been doused in fermented fish. Even more fascinating, garum production and trade were so widespread that the sauce became a status marker. A house with imported garum in the kitchen was signaling wealth, taste, and access to distant goods. A garum bottle on your dinner table said, "Yes, I can afford fish guts from Spain." But it wasn't all luxury and fusion flavoring. Lower-class families had their own garum variants, made from the leftovers, fish heads, tails, bones, and whatever else wasn't claimed by the top shelf. They'd ferment it in smaller jars, sometimes burying it in the yard to speed things along. Imagine home-brewed fish sauce, made next to your turnip patch. You have to respect the dedication. Or fear it. And yet, somehow, garum endured for centuries. Even as the empire changed, crumbled, and reinvented itself, the sauce stayed. So essential was it to the Roman identity that when the Western Empire fell, the knowledge of garum faded too. Later generations in Europe would reinvent fermented sauces, but never quite like this. You take one last sniff of the open vat beside you. Big mistake. You stagger back, eyes watering, tongue rebelling. The vendor laughs, wipes his hands on a greasy rag, and offers you a slice of bread dipped in a thicker, darker version of garum. You decline. Politely. Then with increasing intensity. Rome might run on bread and wine, but garum? That's the gasoline. As you retreat from the reek and the heat, you catch a glimpse of a mural on a tavern wall. It shows a happy man dipping a piece of sausage into a garum bowl while a dog steals a fish behind him. Even in cartoon form, you can smell the scene. It's almost comforting. Almost. You've had your fill of garum, emotionally, spiritually, and very nearly physically. So you follow your nose elsewhere, drifting away from fishy fumes and toward the sweet, spiced warmth of a Roman pastrina, or pastry kitchen. Yes, they had bakeries for bread, but also little shops dedicated to the ancient sweet tooth. Welcome to Rome's dessert scene, where honey flows like water, nuts are precious, and sugar hasn't even been invented yet. That's right. No cane sugar. No chocolate. No vanilla. And yet the Romans still managed to satisfy their cravings for something decadent after a meal of fermented goat and barley stew. You duck into a narrow storefront where women in tunics and dusty aprons work quickly over ceramic mixing bowls, pulling small round pastries from a stone oven. The scent is heavenly: honey, dates, roasted sesame, and perhaps, could it be, poppy seeds. You grab a still-warm treat from a tray, something called globuli. These are cheese fritters, fried and then soaked in hot honey, with a sprinkling of cracked black pepper. You bite in, and it's soft, chewy, slightly tangy from the cheese, but immediately smoothed out by the honey. Then, the pepper hits you. Not overpowering, just enough to make your eyebrows rise. It's dessert, Roman style, sweet, but not cloying, and always with a twist. Mainstream Roman cookbooks, especially Apicius, detail dozens of sweet dishes, most of them involving honey in heroic quantities. Since refined sugar wouldn't reach Europe for centuries, honey was the golden standard. They didn't just drizzle it, they baked it into pastries, simmered it with nuts, whipped it into sauces, and even used it to preserve fruit. Honey was the star, and Rome was its stage. Nearby, a vendor is selling stuffed dates, pitted and filled with almonds, then rolled in cinnamon and crushed sesame. You try one. It tastes like nature's candy bar, rich and satisfying, without any industrial guilt. And the best part? No wrapper. A young boy walks past with a cake called libum, an offering cake usually made for religious ceremonies. It's made from flour and soft cheese, then sweetened and baked on a bay leaf for aroma. You ask if it's his birthday. No, he says. It's for Jupiter. Well then. Some desserts were deeply tied to ritual. Honey cakes were offered at weddings, funerals, and temple festivals. And in more extravagant circles, sweets became displays of wealth and eccentricity. One fringe anecdote claims Emperor Elagabalus once hosted a dinner where guests were pelted with rose petals, and dessert was served in solid gold birdcages. Historians still argue whether this actually happened or whether it's just another bizarre tale from Rome's long list of, "Are we sure that's real?" moments. But not all sweet foods were reserved for the rich. Common folks had their favorites too: simple pancakes called alita dolcia, made from spelt flour, eggs, and honey. Fried in olive oil, they were served hot and often sprinkled with poppy seeds or nuts, depending on what you had lying around. You grab one from a street stall and bite in, crunchy at the edges, soft in the middle. The honey caramelizes as it cools, and you nearly forget the garum entirely. Nearly. You overhear a man bargaining over a small jar of fruit preserves. He's gesturing wildly, arguing over figs soaked in wine and honey. The vendor insists the batch is fresh. No more than a week old, he swears. Given the state of Roman refrigeration, you raise an eyebrow. Speaking of fruit, Rome loved it. Fresh when possible: grapes, figs, pomegranates, cherries, but often dried or cooked down with honey and spices. A popular treat involved poaching pears in wine, then dusting them with black pepper. You try a spoonful. Sweet, yes, but there's always that twist: the Romans rarely let sweetness sit unchallenged. Spice, acid, or salt would always crash the party. Even nuts were given the gourmet treatment. Pine nuts, almonds, and walnuts were ground into pastes and mixed with honey or cheese. You taste a ball of nut-honey cheese mixture rolled in crushed peppercorns. It's like someone tried to reinvent dessert from scratch using only things they found on a hillside, and somehow, it works. One elderly baker tells you about his specialty: honeyed sesame cookies shaped like little birds. He's been making them since he was a child, following a recipe passed down from his mother's mother. He hands you one. It's crunchy, nutty, and faintly floral, like something out of a dream from a time before chocolate existed. You thank him, and he smiles, showing the gap where a molar once was. Too much grit in the bread, he says. There's a warm sort of modesty to these desserts. They're not built to impress with size or sugar overload. They don't come in neon colors. Instead, they aim for balance, just enough sweetness to soften the day, paired with a jolt of spice or a dash of tang to keep you grounded. You wander out of the shop, sticky-fingered and slightly euphoric, as a woman nearby lights a small brazier and warms honey in a copper bowl. She's making melky, a kind of honeyed ricotta mousse, meant to be eaten with dates or spread on bread. She offers you a scoop. You close your eyes and take a bite. It's light, cool, and floral with a trace of sheep's milk funk. You open your eyes slowly. A pigeon is watching you, hoping you'll drop some. You give it a date pit instead. Dessert in ancient Rome may lack chocolate and cupcakes, but it more than makes up for it in soul. These sweets aren't just food, they're tradition, offering, invention, and survival all folded into one warm fritter. You take one last bite of your sesame cookie, rub the honey from your fingers, and head back into the street, content. For now. As you stroll back into the city's heart, fingers still faintly sticky with honey, you notice a familiar sound: the sizzling crackle of oil over fire. You follow it instinctively, nose first, turning down a narrow side street where smoke curls from clay chimneys and voices shout in rhythmic bursts. You've entered the world of Roman street food, loud, chaotic, and somehow always a little greasy. Street vendors in ancient Rome were everywhere. Coponi, papini, and simple food stalls dotted the crowded urban quarters, each one specializing in quick bites for busy citizens. Unlike the grand banquets or home-cooked meals of the elite, these were meals of the people, workers, travelers, and anyone too tired or too poor to cook. You approach a cart where a man is frying something in a shallow copper pan over open flame. He sees your interest and offers you a round, golden fritter. Lagana, he says. Flatbread dough, fried crisp and sprinkled with herbs. You bite in. It's hot, oily, and crackles under your teeth. There's a hint of garlic, a dusting of sea salt, and the kind of crunch that feels like it echoes in your spine. It's shockingly modern, like a proto-pizza crust that hasn't found its toppings yet. And toppings they had. Romans loved turning leftovers into fast food. One popular option: chickpea pancakes topped with leeks, olives, and fish sauce. You hesitate, then try it. The pancake is soft in the center, crisp at the edges, and surprisingly flavorful, despite the questionable garnish. It's sort of like a street taco, but if the taco were made by someone with a fixation on fermented anchovies. Mainstream historical texts describe these food stalls as both lifelines and liabilities. They fed the masses but also attracted crime, drunkenness, and the occasional plague. The Emperor Domitian reportedly cracked down on taverns and street vendors during food shortages, blaming them for hoarding ingredients or stirring unrest. Whether that was fair or just convenient scapegoating, historians still argue. The next stall you reach is selling boiled sausages wrapped in cabbage leaves. The vendor tells you it's a Gaulish recipe. Imported flavor, he says proudly. The sausage is juicy and spicy, rich with herbs like lovage and coriander, and the cabbage leaf gives it a smoky, slightly bitter edge. A surprising blend of refinement and funk. The smell, however, is less charming. Another vendor is pushing maridam, a cheese and garlic spread mashed with herbs and olive oil, served with crusty bread. You take a sample and your eyes water almost immediately. It's potent. Delicious, but potent. Romans weren't shy about garlic. They weaponized it. Then there are the sweets, fried honey dough balls called scriblety, kind of like donut holes, but denser. They're hawked from a separate cart where bees seem to outnumber customers. You try one. It's like eating fried honey itself, sweet, chewy, and vaguely addictive. You immediately understand why poets mention them in love poems. Nothing says devotion like a grease stain and a sugar coma. You pass a cart serving pulse, yes, that humble grain porridge again. Only this version is jazzed up with chopped dates and bits of pork fat. A budget-friendly mashup of sweet and savory. Not great. Not awful. Mostly, warm. You watch a small crowd gather around a papina at the corner, half tavern, half fast food joint. Inside, workers lounge on benches, scooping food from shared platters. Someone's eating pickled fish with hard-boiled eggs. Another has a bowl of lentils floating in dark broth. These aren't lavish meals, but they're hearty. Filling. Satisfying enough to get you to the next shift or the next arena match. One man bites into a meatball and gestures for you to join him. He explains they're made from minced lamb, spiced with cumin, and bound together with breadcrumbs and egg, then pan-fried until crispy. You take one and nod. It's rich, tender, and oddly familiar. It tastes like street food should, messy, flavorful, and borderline suspicious. One fringe food fad currently sweeping this part of town involves stuffed eggs, boiled, halved, and filled with a paste of yolk, pine nuts, vinegar, and pepper. They're oddly refreshing. The texture is creamy, the flavor sharp, and the vendor claims they're an aphrodisiac. You raise an eyebrow. He shrugs. Can't hurt. There's also Lucanicae, spicy sausages named for the region of Lucania. They're sold fresh or grilled over open flames. The smell is intoxicating, thick with fennel and garlic. You buy one, wrap it in a napkin made from reused parchment, and eat it with the zeal of someone who's forgotten what vegetables are. One food historian would later argue that Roman street food closely resembles what we'd now call Mediterranean fast casual, grain-based bowls, grilled proteins, pickled veggies, and a lot of bread. Add a branding consultant and a soft jazz playlist, and this could be a trendy chain in Brooklyn. You pause near a small shrine at the edge of the market. A vendor has left a small offering, bread, a drizzle of honey, and a slice of dried sausage. Even here, in the chaos of deep-fried snacks and rolling carts, the sacred and the edible collide. The sun begins to sink, casting a gold haze over the bustling alley. People are laughing, arguing, eating with their hands, sipping warm wine. It's a little grimy, a little loud, but unmistakably alive. These food stalls aren't just filling bellies, they're feeding the rhythm of the city. And somehow, in the midst of this ancient chaos, you feel completely at home. You lick your fingers, brushing away honey and ash, and step back into the crowd, just another hungry soul chasing the next edible adventure. Night falls over Rome, and the hum of the city doesn't fade, it deepens. The clatter of amphorae gives way to laughter, and the scent of fried snacks is replaced by smoke and incense. You make your way toward the residential districts now, walking past worn columns and dark archways as lanterns flicker behind curtained windows. Inside, families gather for their final meal of the day, cena, and while the public feasts and market snacks were chaotic, cena is a quieter, more personal affair. Unless, of course, you're rich. Let's start with the average Roman. In a cramped apartment called an insula, dinner might be little more than warmed leftovers, pulse again, maybe with some lentils or boiled vegetables. A few olives, maybe a slice of dried sausage if the day's labor went well. You pass a doorway where a family of 5 eats from the same clay bowl, seated on stools or floor mats, passing around a single jug of watered wine. No gold flake here, just bread to dip, and fingers to share it. These meals were intimate, not performative. No couches, no formal service. Just warmth, conversation, and a slow chewing rhythm that tells you, this is survival, softened by habit. If there's dessert, it's probably a figure. If there's meat, it's a lucky day. Now cross the street, literally, and you're in a domus. A townhouse. Someone wealthy. Here, cena is different. It's theater. You're escorted into the triclinium again, but this time there are no live birds in the roast, just meticulous presentation, polished silver, and food arranged like mosaics. The meal comes in gustaccio, starters, prima mensa, main course, and secunda mensa, dessert, much like a modern 3-course dinner. Only, more Roman. You're handed a starter of eggs in pine nut sauce, with a dusting of lovage and black pepper. It's surprisingly refined, soft-boiled eggs with a sharp, nutty creaminess. Beside them, a dish of olives stuffed with anchovies, marinated in vinegar and honey. You wonder who first thought that was a good idea, and why it works. Mainstream records describe how cena became increasingly lavish through the centuries. What started as a simple evening meal evolved, especially in imperial circles, into a multi-hour spectacle. Exotic meats, layered pastries, sculpted jellies made with fish bladder gelatin, yes, that was a thing. One cook was famed for his camel-foot stew. Another for making a roast that looked like a fish until you sliced it open and found more fish. The prima mensa is rolled in next. Roast duck, glazed with dates and wine. Braised leek stuffed with spiced veal. Lentils stewed with mustard and honey, sweet, earthy, confusing. The host waves proudly at a side dish of peas cooked in almond milk. You nod politely. Who knew ancient Rome was doing faux dairy long before your favorite coffee shop? A guest across the room coughs mid-bite and a slave rushes over with a napkin and a small spoonful of some aromatic blend, perhaps to soothe, perhaps just protocol. Another dips a crust of bread into a bowl of spiced chickpea mash and gestures for you to try it. You do. It's comforting. It also tastes suspiciously like garlic and regret. One fringe record describes a woman who faked an allergy to garum so she wouldn't have to eat at imperial feasts. Whether she was avoiding the sauce or the politics, we may never know. Historians still argue whether cena was more about food or power. Likely both. As dinner slows, you find yourself reclining deeper into the cushions, belly full, head a little light. The secunda mensa arrives, apples poached in wine and cinnamon, sprinkled with nuts. Cheese round soaked in honey. A kind of fruit-studded semolina pudding that your host calls grandmother's cure for melancholy. You believe him. You feel oddly at peace. Conversation flows freely now. Someone tells a story about a senator who tried to eat his weight in oysters. Another brags about a trip to Sicily and the lemons the size of a baby's head. The jokes are quiet, the laughter warm. This is the moment Rome breathes out, let's go. Then, suddenly, silence. Everyone looks up. The host raises a cup. A toast, to Saturn, to the gods, to digestion. You raise yours too, and sip. It's not garum flavored, thank Jupiter. Just honeyed wine, cool and clear. A welcome mercy. Not every cena was grand. Not every host provided gold bowls and harp music. But even the simplest meal, shared in a dim room with cracked walls and rough plates, carried meaning. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was ritual. Family. Memory. Community. The pulse of Rome, seasoned with whatever you could afford. As the meal winds down, guests excuse themselves quietly. Some linger. A young man plucks at a lyre. A woman rebraids her hair. Someone falls asleep, face down in lentils. You step out into the alley, full and drowsy. The city is quieter now, though not silent. A dog barks. A lute plays faintly. Somewhere, someone is still eating, still sharing bread and wine under the stars. And you? You head toward the darker edge of the city, curious to know what Rome serves when no one's watching, when the lamps go out, and the real hunger begins. You drift away from the warmth of dinner tables and into the cool pulse of Rome after dark. The streets, once bustling with clattering carts and merchants shouting over each other, are quieter now. The flicker of oil lamps glows in alcoves and doorways. Here and there, shadows move, figures hurrying home, guards pacing slowly, lovers whispering behind columns. But you're following a different trail, the one that leads to the fringe of taste, into Rome's appetite for the strange, the rare, and the downright bizarre. You find yourself near the Subura district, that chaotic tangle of smells and sins, where behind every curtain someone's grilling something peculiar. It's not a formal market, not at this hour, but more a late-night bazaar of oddities, culinary and otherwise. At the first stall, a wiry man gestures to a pot simmering over coals. He lifts the lid and reveals what looks like miniature birds, quail, maybe. No. Too small. Sparrows, he says proudly. Stuffed with pine nuts, herbs, and a drizzle of garum, then boiled in wine. You hesitate. He hands you a toothpick. You poke one. The tiny legs droop over the rim of the pot like they've given up. You try a bite. It's chewy, intensely gamey, and leaves a lingering aftertaste of roasted sadness. This is fringe Roman cuisine, where scarcity and status drive taste. And while most Romans ate pulses and porridge, the elite chased novelty like it was a sport. Tongue of flamingo. Livers of goose. Dormice stuffed with minced pork and coated in poppy seed honey glaze. You walk past a marble cart where one such dormouse lies splayed, glistening under a fig leaf. It looks unsettlingly smug. Mainstream Roman writings confirm it wasn't a joke. The glirarium, a special dormouse jar, was a real thing, clay containers with air holes, used to raise and fatten the little creatures in captivity. They were force-fed nuts and milk until delightfully plump. Cute, if you forget their dinner. And yet, as odd as it seems, the dormouse dish was a beloved delicacy. Wealthy households would serve them whole, tails curled around spiced filling, sometimes dipped in a garum honey glaze. You see one being turned over coals now, the skin crisping, the scent oddly appealing in a "don't tell me what this is until after I've eaten it" kind of way. Not far off, another stall is selling eel, grilled, pickled, boiled, or skewered with onions. You opt for grilled. It's salty, rich, and strangely tender. The vendor tells you, between bites, that eels were once so prized, some nobles adorned theirs with jewelry before cooking them. You nod slowly, not sure whether he's joking. Historians still argue whether that anecdote was literal or metaphor. You're offered a slice of sea urchin pie. The baker describes it as a bit briny, a bit custardy, which sounds like an unholy combination. Still, you're curious. You try it. The texture is gelatinous, like jellied eggs got lost at sea. The flavor is a saltwater punch in the brain, but weirdly, addictive. You take a second bite. You don't hate it. You worry about what that means. One enthusiastic man calls you over to witness the carving of a roast peacock. Not just served, displayed, feathers intact, dyed in vibrant blues and reds. It's a spectacle. You don't eat the feathers. Hopefully. The meat itself is stringy, dry, and almost entirely flavorless, until the chef dumps a warm wine reduction over it, sweetened with dates. Better. Still weird. Very much a "we eat this because we can" experience. A group gathers around a table laden with small bowls of jellyfish, marinated in vinegar and pomegranate syrup. You don't even pretend to resist. You go in with a small wooden fork. It's crunchy. And rubbery. And slick. Like chewing a translucent shoe insert. You nod thoughtfully. Interesting texture, you say, trying to sound cultured. The others agree. And then there's sow's womb. Stewed, sliced, and served cold with mint. You consider it. You decline. Politely, but firmly. There are limits. Some vendors sell concoctions claimed to enhance virility or cure melancholy. One woman hands you a tiny cake made with wild herbs, sheep's milk, and dried lizard. Very energizing, she says. You don't question it. You just chew and hope. Fringe dishes weren't just for fun, they were statements. A Roman banquet wasn't complete without something shocking. Flamingo tongue was a favorite of the very rich, not for its flavor, rumor has it, it tasted like overcooked liver, but because it sounded expensive. Apicius himself has a recipe involving parrot, pine kernels, and fermented barley paste. That's not food. That's performance art. You stop at a final cart. The vendor pulls out a stone jar, cracks the wax seal, and spoons out what looks like creamy mush. Fermented fish guts with fig syrup, he says. You stare. He shrugs. For health. You take a very small taste. It's not as bad as it sounds. But you will not take another. And yet, despite the absurdity, the oddities, and the flavor whiplash, there's something deeply human about it all. This isn't gluttony. Not entirely. It's curiosity. Ambition. A desire to taste the world, and own it. Rome didn't just conquer land. It tried to digest it. You sit on a stone bench, belly full of mystery meats and questionable jellies, and look out over the moonlit roofs. Somewhere in this city, an emperor is finishing a peacock roast. A laborer is gnawing lentils by candlelight. A slave is stealing one last fig. And you? You're chewing dormouse and wondering if flamingo tongue was really that chewy. By now, your stomach is caught somewhere between mild satisfaction and a subtle cry for help. You've tasted Rome's everyday staples and its flamboyant freak show of culinary bragging rights. But to truly understand what Romans thought about food, not just what they ate, but why they ate, you need to step into their minds. Or rather, their myths, medicine, and manuals. You wake up the next morning, still in ancient Rome, don't ask how, and realize that your body isn't thrilled with last night's jellyfish and dormouse surprise. Fortunately, you're in a city that believed food and health were closely linked. Unfortunately, Roman medical advice often came with a side of complete guesswork. You begin your day with a visit to a local healer, or medicus, who insists on examining your diet. He nods approvingly when you mention garlic, pulses, and honey. Then frowns when you mention peacock. Too dry. Unbalanced, he mutters, scribbling something on a wax tablet. You think it might be a bill. Romans believed in the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each food was thought to affect these fluids differently. Cucumbers. Too wet. Lentils. Drying. Red wine. Heating. Cold eel. Apparently, melancholy-inducing. You make a mental note to balance your next street feast with something hot and spicy, maybe a flamingo. Some foods were categorized not just by taste but by temperament. Pork was thought to be moist and cool, while beef was heavy and dry. Chickpeas were hot, but also prone to causing wind. You remember the chickpea pancake. It all makes sense now. Mainstream Roman cookbooks often came with medicinal side notes. Apicius, the king of Roman recipes, advises boiling vegetables twice to make them easier on the stomach. Of course, that probably also removed every bit of nutrition, but hey, better safe than bilious. You wander into a temple courtyard, where a group of older women are preparing an offering to Ceres, goddess of grain. They're baking little loaves of spelt and sprinkling them with poppy seeds. You're handed one with a blessing. It's soft, warm, and strangely calming. Maybe it's the poppy. Maybe it's the placebo. Either way, your indigestion retreats for now. Roman religious rituals were laced with food. Offerings of milk, honey, cakes, and wine were made to household gods, Laras and Penates. Even in the most modest homes, families might leave a small morsel of each meal at a shrine. It wasn't superstition, it was hospitality. The gods were always watching, and no one wanted a hungry deity hovering over the stew pot. In more formal ceremonies, sacrificial animals were offered, their organs examined by priests for omens. The choicest cuts were then cooked and shared among the attendees. Even divine interaction came with a serving spoon. But Roman beliefs about food didn't stop at the altar or the apothecary. Philosophers had opinions too, many, many opinions. The Stoics promoted moderation, arguing that indulgence in food weakened moral fiber. One writer insisted that onions were acceptable, but mushrooms were dangerously decadent. You sit in a garden with a young scholar who's halfway through a lecture on the moral decay of truffle eaters. You nod along, mouth full of fig. The Epicureans, on the other hand, embraced pleasure, but only the sustainable kind. They preferred simple meals that satisfied without overwhelming. Bread, cheese, olives. Eat like this, one says, and your soul will stay balanced. You believe him, right up until someone offers you another honey-drenched fritter and you cave immediately. Balance can wait. Fringe Roman texts include lists of so-called aphrodisiac foods, leeks, pepper, sea urchin, and goat liver, to name a few. The logic is often thin, but persistent. Apparently, if it's pungent and hard to digest, it must also spark romance. Historians still argue whether these claims had cultural traction or were just ancient pickup lines gone wrong. You stop by a stall selling health biscuits made from spelt, vinegar, and myrrh. The vendor insists they align the humors. You try one. It tastes like regret and tree bark, but you nod anyway. Who are you to challenge ancient medical wisdom? A traveling cook shares a recipe he learned from a Gallic healer: crushed garlic, goat cheese, raw egg, and a touch of ash. Good for the joints, he says, stirring with a stick. You quietly decline a taste. He shrugs. More for me. You pass by a group of children playing in the dirt. One is pretending to cook, using pebbles for lentils and fig leaves for bowls. Another pretends to offer a plate to Jupiter. You smile. Even the games revolve around food. Later, you overhear a housewife bargaining for a batch of imported spices. Too hot, says the vendor. They'll unbalance your husband's bile. She nods gravely, then buys twice the amount. You respect her strategy. As the sun climbs higher, a kind of sleepy hunger returns, not the wild cravings of last night's feast, but a calmer, more thoughtful appetite. You sit in a shaded archway, watching a group of workers share a modest meal: bread, olives, soft cheese, and a handful of raisins. They talk, laugh, pause to sip watered wine. No fanfare. Just nourishment. You realize, for all the flamingo tongues and jellyfish pickles, most Romans just wanted to feel okay. To be full, steady, and awake enough to get through another day. Their ideas about food were layered, scientific, spiritual, superstitious, and often contradictory. But at the core, there was a simple truth: what you eat matters. Not just to your stomach, but to your place in the world, your family, your gods, and your health. You rise, stretch, and take one last look around the forum before heading into the winding streets again. There's more to taste. More to learn. And probably another questionable egg dish just around the corner. You've survived garum, flamingo tongue, and enough chickpea-based meals to become mildly leguminous yourself. But now, curiosity leads you not to what the Romans ate, but to what they didn't. Every culture draws invisible lines between what's food and what's unthinkable, and Rome was no different. So tonight, you wander the quieter edges of the city, peering into taboos and food laws, and poking at the things that made even Romans say, "No, thank you." First up, horse meat. You'd think with all the conquest and cavalry, someone would have gotten hungry enough. But no, Romans considered horse meat not just unappetizing but actively inappropriate. The horse was a noble animal, useful in war, agriculture, and transport. Eating one was viewed as something barbarians did, uncivilized, crude. You pass a small butcher stall where a man whispers, "We had some equine sausage, once." Then quickly adds, "Not here." Gaul. You nod solemnly, as if discussing a dark family secret. Next on the non-menu, raw food. Romans didn't do raw. Not fish, not meat, not much of anything. The idea of eating uncooked flesh was offensive to the Roman palate. Even vegetables were usually boiled within an inch of their dignity. You remember that squidgy jellyfish from before and realize it had, in fact, been boiled 3 times. Just in case. But what really drew moral fire was gluttony. Sure, they had banquets. Sure, they served dormice dipped in gold. But Rome was still a society that paid lip service to discipline. Cato the Elder scolded fellow citizens for spending too much on imported delicacies. He considered figs from Carthage suspect and Greek food philosophically dangerous. His favorite snack: plain cabbage. Raw. Alone. You wonder if that explains the man's famously sour attitude. One fringe tale tells of a senator who refused to eat foreign fruit on principle. When someone brought dates from Judea, he hurled them into the Tiber. Whether this was a stand against luxury or just a personal vendetta against sticky fingers, historians still argue. Religious observance also shaped what could or couldn't be eaten. Certain festival days demanded abstaining from meat or drinking only diluted wine. During rites for the goddess Vesta, only simple plant-based foods were permitted. You peer into a small shrine and see a clay bowl of chickpeas and leeks set out as an offering. No peacock there. Interestingly, cannibalism, though a favorite Roman insult to hurl at savages, was almost never reported within the empire itself. Even in times of siege and starvation, sources are oddly silent. Which might mean it was so taboo, no one dared write about it, or it didn't happen. You choose not to speculate. You stroll into a modest tavern where a group of men are arguing over the merits of owl meat. One claims it cures gout. Another swears it brings madness. The bartender, unfazed, pours wine and says, "Only if you catch it with your bare hands." Everyone laughs. No one orders it. You ask if there are any animals completely forbidden. One man leans in. "Snake," he says. You eat that, and your dreams go black. You're not sure if that's superstition or food safety advice, but you write it down anyway. Even within Roman society, food restrictions varied wildly by class, region, and occupation. Gladiators were famously nicknamed barley men because their diets were heavy in grains and legumes. Meat was rare, too expensive, too heavy. A lightweight fighter wasn't just fit, he was frugal. In contrast, priests of certain cults followed strict dietary codes. The Flamen priest of Jupiter, wasn't allowed to touch raw meat or even see a cooked one on certain days. His meals were prepared under special supervision. Rumor has it, once a house servant accidentally fed him salted pork on a fast day, and the entire kitchen staff was dismissed. Or possibly cursed. Even emperors weren't above food restrictions, at least, symbolically. Augustus famously kept his meals simple: bread, cheese, a few dried fruits. It was all public image, of course. Behind the scenes, banquets galore. But for the average Roman, seeing restraint in their leaders' diets was reassuring. Whether real or theatrical, it mattered. And then there were the foods considered simply too foreign. Romans were selective about what they adopted. Persian stews. Interesting. Egyptian beer. Meh. German blood sausages. Absolutely not. That was barbarian fare. Romans didn't drink blood. Except, when they did. One fringe medical text claims a fresh gladiator's blood could cure epilepsy. Supposedly, fans would rush into the arena after a match and scoop up the puddles. You shudder. Historians still argue whether this was real or just morbid propaganda. Either way, you decline the blood sausage. There's also class taboo. Eating certain foods could mark you as low. Beans, for example, were nutritious and cheap, but also associated with funerals and gas. Some Roman elites refused to touch them. You imagine a senator wrinkling his nose at a perfectly good lentil stew. Pity. You stop by a small table where a woman sells bundles of herbs wrapped in linen. Warding spices, she says. To keep away foods that bring madness. You ask what those are. Raw onions, she whispers. And undercooked snails. You back away slowly. Every society has its culinary blind spots. Romans couldn't fathom sushi, or rare steak, or even dipping bread in oil without toasting it first. Their kitchen logic had different rules, different fears. And though they embraced excess in so many ways, their food taboos remind you they were still human, nervous about the unknown, shaped by faith, custom, and one too many stomach aches. As you wander on, you pass a child holding a plate of something mysterious. You ask what it is. He shrugs. Not allowed to eat it. Grandma says it's for the spirits. You nod. Sometimes, not eating something says more than indulging in it ever could. You leave the alley behind, your stomach grateful for the night off. Tomorrow, maybe something simple. Just bread and honey. And maybe a cucumber, if the humors allow. It's early morning in Rome again, not the loud, smoky Rome of markets and chariots, but the quiet one. You walk through the misty hush of back streets before the sun has fully climbed over the terracotta rooftops. For once, you're not chasing the scent of grilled dormouse or inspecting someone's spelt porridge. No. Today, you're interested in where all this food came from, before it hit the skillet. Welcome to the Roman supply chain. First, grain. The true lifeblood of Rome, not gold, not slaves, not even wine. Grain. Mostly wheat, some barley, and a dash of spelt for variety. Rome ran on grain the way your local coffee shop runs on caffeine. Without it, people rioted. Governments toppled. Bread got weird. You follow a long caravan rumbling into the city, oxen pulling huge sacks of imported wheat. Some of it came from the fertile Nile Valley. Egypt was Rome's breadbasket after Augustus claimed it. Other sacks are stamped with African, Sicilian, and even Gallic markings. It's a logistical marvel, really. Dozens of ships, hundreds of carts, thousands of backs bending to keep Rome fed. You hear a man cursing loudly, his carts will crack under the weight of olive oil amphorae. He kicks the axle, wipes his brow, and mutters about another month like this, putting him out of business. The olive oil trade was just as intense as grain. It flowed in from Hispania and the countryside, packed into thousands of clay jars, each sealed with pitch. It greased pans, flavored food, fueled lamps, and occasionally served as Roman skincare. Yes, olive oil, the original all-in-one. Inside the city, the Horia, massive public warehouses, store vast quantities of this stuff. You peer through the slatted doors of one, where workers shuffle back and forth, tallying shipments with wax tablets. The air smells of dust, yeast, and heat. Somewhere, grain is being sifted for stones and rodents. You spot a cat on patrol. It's clearly an employee. But the Romans weren't content to rely only on imports. You wander out to the edges of the city, where small urban farms sit between shrines and tombs. Plots of onions, leeks, and chickpeas poke up from dry earth. A woman in a simple tunic picks herbs and scolds a goat. These gardens fed families, filled stew pots, and flavored the otherwise grim realities of Roman apartment living. One mainstream fact that surprises you, despite the size of Rome, most people ate local produce whenever possible. Shipping was expensive, spoilage common, and lettuce doesn't last long on a donkey cart. So while the elite feasted on pomegranate from the Levant or oysters from Britannia, the average Roman dined on whatever the neighborhood plot could grow. You stop at a small chicken enclosure. A boy is feeding them cracked barley. He says his father barters the eggs for fish at the docks. Sometimes we get eels, He whispers, like it's a scandal. You nod approvingly. Speaking of fish, you make your way down to the banks of the Tiber, near the docks. The smell hits first. Salty, briny, pungent. This is where garum begins, hundreds of barrels of fish parts fermenting under the sun, like an olfactory punishment for someone's past life. Men stir the vats, checking the brine. Still a week, one says, tapping the lid. Another pours fresh anchovy bits into the slop. You take one step back. Then 3 more. Historians still argue whether the garum industry was as widespread within the city as the texts suggest, or if most of it happened further out. Either way, the smell leaves little to the imagination. You marvel that this sticky brown sauce could travel hundreds of miles in clay jars and still arrive wanted. Further down the river, imported luxuries are being unloaded, figs from Syria, cinnamon from India, peppercorns that cost more per ounce than gold. These are not for the average citizen. These are for banquets. Senators. Emperors. For that one guy who insists his honey come from alpine bees and nowhere else. You follow a sack of pepper all the way to a merchant's villa, where spices are stored like treasure. He shows you a jar of saffron threads and mutters, more valuable than a new roof. You believe him. You've seen his roof. It's questionable. Not far from the docks, butcher shops begin setting up. Slabs of pork hang from hooks. Sheep are being skinned with quick, practiced movements. The air is thick with iron and hay. You watch a man carve a pig's cheek and toss it to a barking dog. Nothing is wasted. Bones are saved for broth. Organs are sold cheap. Fat is rendered for cooking. The cycle continues. You pass a man boiling hooves for gelatin and another stirring blood into a thick sausage casing. You look away. And then immediately back again. Curiosity is cruel like that. Even wine has its complex path. Most Romans drank it diluted, full-strength wine was considered uncivilized. You visit a vineyard on the city's edge. The farmer offers you a sip of the current vintage. It's thick, sweet, almost raisin-y. You cough a little, and he chuckles. Best after a year in the amphora, he says, as if apologizing for its enthusiasm. The grapes are crushed underfoot, fermented in clay jars sealed with resin, and flavored with herbs, honey, or seawater, depending on the customer's tastes or budget. One recipe calls for a handful of salt and a sprig of wormwood. Another for boiled must and rose petals. You suspect someone somewhere is just making it up as they go. And through all this movement, grain, oil, fish, fruit, meat, wine, Rome's streets fill with noise, smell, and tension. A cart breaks down. A shipment spoils. A grain shortage looms. The emperor is not pleased. People notice. The entire food system is a delicate beast. One bad harvest in Africa. Rome gets cranky. 2. Rome burns. And yet, it mostly worked. For centuries. The Romans, with no refrigeration, no mechanized shipping, and questionable hygiene, managed to feed 1 million people a day. They built systems, huge ones, that moved food from fields and oceans to tables and trenchers. You lean against a wall, watching another shipment of figs roll past. You think about every bite you've taken, sweet, sour, strange, and realize how many hands it passed through first. Farmers, pickers, transporters, fermenters, cooks, street vendors. Even the cat that kept the rats away. Food in Rome wasn't just flavor. It was empire. Now it's dusk again. The final blush of sunlight lingers on red-tiled roofs and columns worn smooth by time and palms. Rome exhales slowly, and so do you. It's been a long walk, through marketplaces, kitchens, smoky taverns, fragrant temples, and fish-scented alleys, but tonight, it's time to let the flavors rest. You make your way to a quiet hilltop garden. Olive trees lean toward the breeze. A fig tree, half-shadowed, sighs under the weight of ripening fruit. A servant you don't know, and who doesn't ask your name, brings a tray. Nothing extravagant. Just a slice of coarse bread, a few olives, some goat cheese wrapped in grape leaves. A cup of watered wine, red and dull and perfect. It's not a feast. It's a whisper. And somehow, that feels like exactly what you need. You settle under the tree, back against rough bark, and watch the city light up in patches. Oil lamps flickering from windows, tavern doorways glowing gold, the glow of a brazier in a corner stall where someone is still grilling sausages. Even in its quietest hour, Rome keeps feeding itself. Someone is always eating. Or cooking. Or praying over a bowl of lentils. You think about the endless contrasts of this place, about dormouse stews and humble grain mash, about temples and taverns, elite banquets and alley snacks. Food here was never just food. It was identity. It told the world who you were, what you believed, how much power you had, and how much pepper you could afford. One mainstream fact you recall: emperors used grain doles not just to feed the poor but to secure loyalty. To feed Rome was to rule Rome. They understood that bellies led to votes, well, shouts of support in the forum, anyway. The term, bread and circuses, wasn't just satire, it was strategy. A scholar once wrote that Roman food was the empire in miniature. Imported, adapted, copied, corrupted. Served hot or cold, spiced or plain, rich or revolting. And yet, it endured. Through revolts, assassinations, and volcanoes. People kept eating. There were fringe beliefs, too. That figs gave you strength before battle. That onions could cure broken hearts. That eating pomegranate seeds would keep demons away. You smile at that one. Maybe it worked. You haven't seen a demon all week. Historians still argue whether food was Rome's greatest achievement or simply its most underestimated one. Roads, aqueducts, armies, yes. But a system that brought wine from Spain, fish sauce from North Africa, spices from India, and apples from Gaul to a single table? That's something even modern cities struggle with. And Rome didn't just import food, it exported cuisine. Roman recipes spread with the legions, shaped tastes across continents. Garum in Britain. Grape cultivation in France. That legacy still lingers, silent and chewy. You take one last bite of your bread, hard on the edges but soft at the center. The cheese is tangy, the olives briny and firm. The wine slips down your throat with a tired sort of warmth. You can hear someone singing in the distance, softly, off-key. Maybe a lullaby. Maybe a drinking song. You glance at the stars emerging overhead, one by one. The same stars Roman farmers looked to when planting their chickpeas. The same stars Caesar stared at while plotting his next feast or conquest. And now they watch you, a full stomach and a quieter heart, sitting in the shadow of the most food-obsessed empire the world had known. And so, with grain still rustling in distant fields, and ovens cooling in every alley, you close your eyes and drift. The streets are silent now. You're not walking anymore, you're floating. The taste of honey still lingers faintly on your tongue, and the night air carries traces of distant rosemary smoke and olive wood burning low in someone's hearth. Your thoughts drift, slower now. Softer. Like leaves carried down a quiet river. You think about how every flavor you encountered had a story. A cracked clay bowl of porridge. A flicker of wine in a bronze cup. A sausage sizzling in a pan over fire. Nothing was wasted, nothing too strange to try, or too humble to savor. Even the oddities had a kind of grace. The jellyfish. The sweet sour beans. The eels, curled like question marks. Rome whispered through each meal. Not just with richness and flair, but with rhythm. A pattern. A way of life drawn through bread and spice and stew. A culture written in crumbs. The city's pulse quiets beneath you. Torches fade. Kitchens close. The cats take over the alleys again. And all that's left is the warm hush of sleep closing in. The wine has mellowed your thoughts. The bread has grounded them. Even the fig tree, swaying overhead, feels like it's trying to lull you. So now, you breathe slowly. You let the stories settle, like flour in a bowl. And you let go. Because tonight, you've eaten like Rome. And now, you can sleep like it, too.